I hope all of you are fine and had a good day. And we are very privileged to welcome today Mr. Vivek Kaul. I don't want to introduce him the way a very formal introduction. You all have read his profile. You know who is he, what kind of books he has written. I just want to say that he's somebody I enjoy reading so much because he has made the most complicated nuances of banking in India open to common people. So the way he has explained the various understand how banks work, what is a bad money, what are the NPAs, why we should be bothered about it. These are the things which where some kind of a always used to be behind the big economists, the big people, big guys sitting in Delhi School of Economics, Reserve Bank of India, and so on and so forth. And all the big journalists who wrote for the Economic Times, Financial Times, and so on and so forth. But if you read his writing, he has made all those things so accessible and so lucidly clear for students like us who want to learn many things about banking and so and other similar issues, but didn't have the conceptual understanding. So we are really grateful and thank you so much, Mr. Kaul, for writing a series of books on that, and especially your various pieces which comes in various newspapers. They have been very illuminating to many of us. Uh, and with these words, I don't want to go on because all of us have already read your profile. They know who you are. Many of them have heard your YouTube videos. So they know of you very well. So these words, I have some lingering queries if I can be allowed to put forth.
Sure.
When we say this NPA business in India, which recently emerges because of various populist factor, if I may quote, is it our subprime crisis? Is it the Indian version of the subprime crisis?
No,
You can later embed it whenever you.
I'll answer it in my
speech. And the other thing which many students has also asked many times in the past, which I don't think we had sufficiently good answer, should they be afraid of depositing in the bank now?
Okay.
Crisis which has gone to that level, it's not only the big people who are defaulting, but it's the small retailers, the small SMEs who are also defaulting on it.
Okay. So let me just make a note. Indian version of subprime and deposit. Okay.
Yeah. So whenever you just, because these are the questions.
No, I will. These are, in fact, I guess, particularly the deposit question is very important, and you should know what you're doing with your money and where you're putting it and whether it's safe or not.
Yeah. So over to you. It's all over you. And I'll request that in the end, if you give us students some time to probe questions, ask, clarify.
Sure. So, we don't have to be any, formal. I mean, I am free. I'm done for the day. And it depends on their capacity to take me.
Yeah. So. Okay. So I'll inform everybody that this session is being recorded. And if you want to ask questions, you can raise your hands digitally, not waste time giving me. Digitally, you can raise your hand and or post your question in the chat box.
I think that's a better idea to post it in the chat box so that Mr. Kaul can take a look at them and choose what he is most relevant. So.
Yeah, sure. Mr. Kaul. Yeah.
Thank you. So good evening, everyone. Thank you to the Tata Institute of Social Sciences and for sort of inviting me, Professor Aseem Prakash, who I have been coordinating with on email. So thank you, everyone, for having me over. Now, this is not the first time I'm doing a webinar. I mean, I've been doing it for the last 6-7 months, and it's not that with practice, this is something that one has become comfortable with. In fact, the more webinars I do, the more uncomfortable I get, because sometimes it just feels like speaking into a void. One is like all alone in a room and the AC is on and it's totally silent, and so it just feels very, very weird. So, having said that, I would have preferred to do this face to face, but having said that, the times that we are in, that is obviously difficult. Now, And I mean, when I say I would have loved to do it face to face, I mean, I really mean it, because I just love Hyderabad. I mean, I lived there for 3 years, 2002 to 2005, and those were very different days. Hyderabad of then was very different from the Hyderabad of now, and I used to stay very close to the. I mean, for those who don't know Hyderabad as such, I used to stay in Begumpet, which is where Hyderabad ends and Secunderabad starts. And it used to be right next to the old airport. In fact, walking distance. So nowhere in India was an airport walking distance from where one lived. So it was just beautiful, and Hyderabad at that point of time was just, it was an upcoming. I mean, it was a city, yes, but it wasn't really a out and out metropolitan city like it is now. So things were cheap. An apartment that I lived in cost me 3,000 rupees per month, and even that people said was, you're paying much more than you should. Uh, and the best, the best part, and something that I can't sort of ever forget, is the fact that lunch buffets started at 125 rupees. Eat all. So for 125 rupees, you could sit there and eat as much as you wanted to. So anyway, so that's the bit about Hyderabad. No, I mean, I'm not obviously going to talk about Hyderabad today. I will be talking, talking about, or rather, the topic for my talk is called the bad money of public sector banks. Why there is no free lunch in economics. Now, so before I sort of start with what I want to say today, I think it's important that I explain what. There's some noise coming in. Can we? Hello?
May I request all of you to kindly mute yourself?
There's some weird noise coming in the background. So thank you. Okay. So, before I sort of start talking about what I have planned to, I think first it's most important that I explain bad money. I mean, bad. What do I mean by bad money? Now, bad money obviously is the title of my book, and book titles, need to sound in a certain way. Like corporates when talking, need to use a lot of management jargon. Hindi films need to have happy endings. So along similar lines, book titles need to sound in a certain way. Now, the thing is that what are bad loans? So bad loans are what is bad money? Bad money is nothing but bad loans which have accumulated in the Indian financial system. Now the question is, what are bad loans? Bad loans are loans which haven't been repaid for a period of 90 days or more, largely. That's the definition. So basically, loans which have been defaulted on and haven't been repaid, the EMI hasn't been repaid for 90 days or more, so for 3 months or more. Now, the thing was that I couldn't have, if I had called my book Bad Loans instead of Bad Money, I mean, nobody really would have bought it. So it would have become like a PhD thesis, which, the guy writing it and, the guy clearing it, there are only two people who get around to reading a PhD thesis, largely. So, which is why the title of the book was Bad Money. And bad money, as I said, is nothing but the overall bad loans in the Indian banking system, loans which have been defaulted on, loans which haven't been repaid. Now, the first question that I sort of want to answer is, or rather, I mean, before I again get into the meat of the topic, I want to sort of tell you guys a little story. And, the first chapter of my book, for those who have read it, is called Let's Say Thank You to Nirav Modi. Now, Nirav Modi, as you would know, was this famous diamond merchant, who escaped from the country sometime in January 2018 and defrauded the Punjab National Bank of rupees 12,645.97 crore. I mean, that's the exact number that the government gave in the Lok Sabha, close to around $2 billion. Now the question is, why do I start my book by saying, thank you to Nirav Modi? And so there is a little backstory to it. Now, sometime in February 2018, I was at the Symbiosis University in Pune. I had gone there to sort of teach a course to the students of journalism. Now, for those who have been to Symbiosis University would know that it's built on a hill. And on the top of the hill is basically the guest house. So where if you go there to teach for a couple of days, that's where they put you. And it's very, very beautiful. And Pune anyway, is a very beautiful city. So I was like in a car and I was being driven up, I was being driven up the hill. And somewhere in between, I get a call from this, landline number in Noida. So I take the call, and on the other side was a gentleman talking in chaste Hindi, and he said something to the effect of "Mahoday, kya main Vivek call se baat kar raha hu?" तो मैंने बोला हाँ आप Vivek call se baat kar rahe हैं, and then we got talking, and so he was a journalist calling from this newspaper called Dainik Jagran, which is the largest selling Hindi newspaper in India, which is also the largest selling newspaper in India. Now, they were essentially interested in a piece which talked about the bad loans of public sector banks and the danger that, that sort of created for the public at large. Now, I obviously said yes to writing the piece. And then, as I sort of reached my room and started thinking, and I started asking myself as to why are these guys suddenly so interested in the bad loans of public sector banks? And the answer came to me after a while. Now, this was February 2018. By December 2017, the bad loans of public sector banks had already touched 8 lakh crore. Okay, 8 lakh crore is not a small number. By March 2018, they would touch 8.96 lakh crore, which is close to 9 lakh crore. Now, why did the Indian language press suddenly wake up after public sector banks had accumulated bad loans of 8 lakh crore? And and I had been writing on banks and banking for almost five years by then. So the answer came to me gradually, and the answer comes from psychology. Psychologists have this concept called identified life and statistical life. As long as you give statistics to people, they do not worry about a situation. But the moment you put a face to that situation, the moment you put a story to that situation, they start worrying about it. Now, an excellent example of this in the recent past is Amitabh Bachchan getting COVID. Now, Amitabh Bachchan wasn't the first guy to get COVID in India. There were some, 2.5, 3 lakh, 4 lakh people who had already got COVID by then. But the fact that Amitabh Bachchan got COVID was, one, it was noticed, and two, it made a lot of people careful because, everyone was like, if it can happen to Amitabh Bachchan, who am I? I mean, it can happen to me as well. A very good similar example is Amit Shah getting COVID. So what happened is a large statistic essentially became, people started registering it. Another good example of this differentiation between a statistical life and an identified life, and you guys, most of this, in fact, all of the students will be too young to remember this. In 1984, on December 25th, 1984, the Bhopal gas tragedy happened. And these were not, these were pre-television. I mean, television was there, but not in most homes. Pre-television, pre-mobile phone, pre-everything, pre-private media days. Private media only existed in the newspaper space. So your information that you got was limited by what you read in the newspaper next day, or what you sort of saw on the government media. I mean, the All India Radio, or what you heard on the All India Radio, or what you saw on Doordarshan. Now, the first sort of, India at large, at least people in India who read English magazines, started to realize how bad the disaster was when they saw the India Today cover. I mean, the India Today magazine used to be a weekly magazine back then. And there was a famous picture taken by this photographer called Raghu Rai, of this young girl who had died and who was being buried, but her skull was sort of still popping out of the ground. And I mean, for those who have seen that picture would definitely remember it. And that was the first time India at large realized that, you know, how bad the disaster was. Now, it wasn't like up until then people did not know that so many people had died, or you know, we had, the data was there, but the gravity of the realization wasn't. Another great example of this is, and this is something that you guys can relate to, a few years back, a young Syrian child called Aylan Kurdi died, and his picture was splashed across the world media. I mean, he had died on a beach, and that picture was splashed. And that one picture did more to the cause of people leaving Syria and hoping to enter Europe than all these statistics put together. So the point I'm trying to make here is that at times, or you know, it's an individual or a story going with an individual which has a greater impact on the situation than the statistics of the situation. So which is why I said thank you to Nirav Modi, because Nirav Modi was the one who made a large part of India realize that there is a problem with the deposits in public sector banks. Now, you might get back to me and ask me, but why not Vijay Mallya? Because Vijay Mallya had, you know, I mean, he probably did not defraud the banks, or even if he did not defraud the banks to the extent that Nirav Modi did. And he also left the country, and he's also in UK. And I mean, the difference being right now being that Nirav Modi is in jail and Mallya isn't. But you know, here's the thing: Mallya left the country sometime in 2016. And at that point of time, the situation as it stood in the public domain wasn't really that bad. So that realization really didn't come in when Mallya left. But when Nirav Modi left, you know, the realization started to come in. And also, you know, you have to take into account the fact that, you know, he had a very, you know, he had a great story behind him. You know, here was this man trading diamonds, who had houses all over the world, who traveled all over the world, who partied, who had a taste for paintings. He had beautiful homes, was friends with Priyanka Chopra. So all these factors came together, and people sort of, you know, realized that there is a problem with public sector banks. And which is why I sort of, when I started my book, I sort of said, thank you to Nirav Modi. Now, to the real story of bad loans of public sector banks, or what I call bad money. So the total bad money in the Indian financial system peaked at rupees 10.39 lakh crore as of March 2018. Of that, the public sector bank bad loans stood at around 8.96 lakh crore. 2 years later, as of March 2020, the bad loans of public sector banks were at around the bad loans of public sector banks were at around 7.25 lakh crore, and the overall bad loans of the system are at around 9 lakh crore. Now, you know, so here's a little you know, interesting story, and so the real bad loans of public sector banks as of March 2020 are 6.78 lakh crore. But I sort of say that 6.78 lakh crore is not the right number. The right number is 7.25 lakh crore. And the reason for that is that as of March 2018, IDBI Bank, which is a mid-level bank, was a public sector bank. And in January 2019, as of 21st January 2019, it was recategorized to be a private bank. Now, it was recategorized to be a private bank because the government of India sold its, or rather passed on its stake in the bank to the Life Insurance Corporation of India. Okay. Now, a Life Insurance Corporation of India owning a bank does not make it a private bank. No, it's like saying, to give you a very weird analogy, it's like saying Indian Chinese is as good as real Chinese, or rather Indian Chinese is same as Chinese, you know. I mean, the Indian Chinese food is very, very different from real Chinese food. I mean, those who have a taste for Indian Chinese food will find it very, very difficult to eat real Chinese food. So that's the, so if you sort of, so I still believe, or rather, I still feel that IDBI Bank is a public sector bank, and its bad loans should be included in the public sector bad loan number. So we have bad loans of around 9 lakh crore, and public sector bank bad loans are at around 7.25 lakh crore. The question is, how did we get there? When I started writing my book, and I mean, I started writing it sometime in April 2019, last year. And I was convinced that this happened because of crony capitalism. And in fact, if for those who have sort of read my book, or at least bought it and seen it, they would know that my book essentially starts with an Urdu couplet. And it goes like this: गरीब लहरों पर पहरे बिठाए जाते हैं, समुंदरों की तलाशी कोई नहीं लेता. This has been written by the greatest living Urdu poet, Wasim Barelvi, and which is why I will not make an attempt to translate it. But for those who do not understand, Hindustani, the closest equivalent of this in English is something that George Orwell wrote in Animal Farm, when he said that all men are equal, but some men are more equal than others. So when I started, I was sort of convinced that this is a story around crony capitalism, and I need to write that story. So, the first thing is, how do you define crony capitalism? I mean, in common terms, it's like, the minister called the banker, the bureaucrat called the banker. But there has to be a little more, in a book of 300 pages, you can't just say that crony capitalism is a minister calling a banker, or a bureaucrat calling a banker and asking him to make a loan which he shouldn't. So, so the framework that I used was something called the separation between knowledge and power. This was a framework that an American economist called Thomas Sowell, economist and philosopher called Thomas Sowell, came up with. And it's a very simple sort of framework wherein an individual in a position, he has the knowledge to make a decision, he has done his due diligence, and he has a knowledge to make that decision, and he is allowed to make that decision. So then he has both knowledge as well as power to make a decision. Then there are individuals who have the knowledge to make a decision. They can do the proper due diligence, but they may not have the power to make that decision, right? So something along these lines happens in public sector banks, wherein a banker may have the power to sort of may have the knowledge whether to give a loan to a large corporate or not, but he may not have the power to decide on it. I mean, the power to decide on it may be with his bosses, they may be with the bureaucrats, or they may simply be with the politician. Now, why do I say this? I say this because there is evidence for it. When public sector bankers give out retail loans, now retail loans are basically home loans, vehicle loans, credit cards, and so on. So when public sector bankers give out retail loans, they do a as bad or as good a job of it as private sector bankers. So what does that mean? That basically means that when public sector bankers are giving out retail loans, they do proper due diligence, and obviously they make the decision as well after doing that due diligence. So if they feel that there is no need to give this loan because this guy will not be able to repay it, then they can make that decision, which is true about private banks as well. But when it comes to a corporate loan, especially to a large corporate, this dynamic breaks down. The link between knowledge and power breaks down, and this is nothing but crony capitalism. Now the problem with crony capitalism is, it is easy to talk about it. It is very easy to write about it in a column that, oh, ministers called and bureaucrats called. But how do you go around proving something like this, right? I mean, how do you prove that there was a quid pro quo? And that is where it becomes very, very difficult. So Dr. Raghuram Rajan, who was the RBI governor between 13 and 2016, I think he wrote or rather said in one of his speeches regarding this problem of bad loans, and I quote him, "Undoubtedly, there was some malfeasance and corruption, but it's hard to tell banker exuberance, incompetence, and corruption apart." So, you might think it is crony capitalism, but it might simply be a banker not doing proper due diligence while giving out a loan. So how do you establish crony capitalism beyond doubt? Also, as I kept researching the book, I realized that there was a lot more to the bad loan problem than just crony capitalism. And so one of the frameworks that I use in the book to essentially give it a structure, to give the book an overall structure, I use this I use this famous hypothesis by an American economist called Hyman Minsky, and it's called the financial stability hypothesis. Now, what is this financial stability hypothesis? I will just define it for you like the way Minsky defined it in his book, Stabilizing an Unstable Economy. And this is what he wrote, and I quote. Okay, and just let me, this is a slightly longish quote, so let me just quote that for you first, and then I'll try explaining it. Okay, and this is what Minsky writes in Stabilizing an Unstable Economy. The way in which a speculative boom emerges and how an unstable crisis-prone financial and economic system develops are of particular importance in any description of the economic process that is relevant for this economy. Instability emerges as a period of relative tranquil growth is transformed into a speculative boom. This occurs because the acceptable and the desired liability structures of business firms, corporations, and the organizations acting as middlemen in finance change in response to the success of the economy. Now, if your head is spinning by now, Minsky is to be blamed for it. So Minsky, like many other economists, wrote in code, and this was a code which only other economists understood. Now, what this hypothesis essentially, financial instability hypothesis essentially says, in very, very simple English, is that stability leads to instability. Now, what does that mean? That essentially means that the basic premise is that when times are good and people have seen a period of healthy economic growth, they want to take on more risk. Banks are willing to give riskier loans than they usually would, and businessmen also want to take on more risk and expand their enterprises and are happy to borrow. Now, I mean, to give you a simpler example of stability leading to instability, so let me talk about cricket. Okay. Now, I mean, if you've seen if you've seen and watched cricket regularly, you would have heard certain commentators say at certain points of time that this batsman is out of form, or that this bowler is bowling way too many no balls. Now, the fact is that no batsman essentially goes out of form while batting only in matches. You go out of form while batting during the nets, or you develop this habit of bowling too many no balls, not in matches, but by being lazy when you're bowling during the nets. And why does that happen? It happens because, you're batting well, and you sort of start to assume that you'll continue to bat well, or you're bowling well and you start to assume that you'll continue to bowl well. So basically, stability leads to instability that way. So that's the basic thing. Now, in the context of banking, Minsky provides he talks about 3 stages of finance. What are these 3 stages of finance? and when he talks about 3 stages of finance, he's essentially talking about a company which has taken on a loan and has to repay that loan to a bank. So the first stage is the hedge stage. And in a hedge stage, the company is making enough money to repay the interest as well as the principal of the loan. The second stage a company might enter is called the speculative stage. Now, what happens is in the speculative stage, the company is making enough money to repay the interest on the loan, but not the principal. The third stage is called the Ponzi stage. Now, in the Ponzi stage, essentially, the company is not making enough money either to be able to repay the interest on the loan or to be able to repay the principal. Now, and if it has to sort of repay the interest as well as the principal on the loan, it has to take on a fresh loan. Okay. The name Ponzi essentially comes from a gentleman called Charles Ponzi, who in August 1919 launched an investment scheme in the city of Boston in United States, where he promised to double investor money in 90 days. First he said 90 days, and then he reduced that 90 days to 45 days. He said, I will double your money in 45 days. Now, by the time his fraud was found out, he had raised close to around $40 million, which was a lot of money back then. Now, what he was essentially doing was very, very simple. What he was doing was he was taking the money being brought in by the newer investors and using that money to pay off the older investors. Now, as long as the hype on the scheme was strong and the money coming in was greater than the money going out, the scheme sort of ran. But the moment the money coming in became lesser than the money that had to be repaid to older investors, the scheme collapsed. And so this Ponzi, the name comes from there, and essentially fresh money is used to repay older investors. So something similar happens when you reach the Ponzi stage of finance, wherein you are not in a position to repay that loan, and all you can do is take on a fresh loan to repay the principal as well as the interest on the old loan. Now the question is, why would a bank give a fresh loan to a customer who is not in a position to pay an old loan? And we'll come to that. So the entire situation was a very good example of stability leading to instability. How did that happen? That happened primarily because between 2004 and 2006, 3 years, India grew at greater than 9%, and it was an era when nothing could go wrong. And people assume that that 9% growth is going to continue. I mean, I remember between 2005, in each of the years, 2005, 2006, and 2007, my salary went up 3 times in each year. I mean, not 3 times in 3 years. So those were the days. I mean, companies were trying to sort of trying hard to ensure that people did not leave them. Salaries went up dramatically. And everyone was basically having a good time, and the assumption was that India will become the next China. So and when India would become the next China, obviously India would need many more resources than it had at that point of time. And a lot of a lot of businessmen essentially started to cash in on this, or at least wanting to cash in on this. And this ended up in a situation where there was a borrowing binge at the end of businessmen, and there was a lending binge as well at the end of banks. So businessmen obviously wanted to borrow in order to cash in on India becoming the next China, but banks were also more than happy to lend to anyone who was willing to borrow. And Raghuram Rajan has a very interesting take on this, and I'd just like to read that out. And he writes, I think I will need to find it. So as he writes, and I quote, "It's at such times that banks make mistakes. They extrapolate past growth and performance to the future. So they are willing to accept higher leverage in projects and less promoter equity. Higher leverage means, basically give out more loans, and less promoter equity means that the guy who is promoting the business invests less of his own money into the project, so that his risk is lower, but the risk of the bank is higher. So they are willing to accept high leverage in projects and less promoter equity. Indeed, sometimes banks signed up to lend based on project reporters by the promoter's investment bank without doing their own due diligence. In fact, Rajan even recounted a story that a business promoter had told him. He was pursued then by banks waving checkbooks, asking him to name the amount he wanted. So, so there was this, the spirit of the times was such that the bankers wanted to lend, and the corporates wanted to sort of borrow. And all this money, essentially went into new power companies, new infrastructure projects, new real estate projects, new steel projects, and so on, textile projects. So there was a huge borrowing binge, and there was a huge lending binge as well. Now, in 2008, the financial crisis started with Lehman Brothers, the fourth largest fourth largest investment bank in Wall Street, going bust. Because of that, the global growth slowed down. Growth in India also slowed down. But in order to sort of pump prime the growth, the Indian politicians decided that public sector banks need to continue lending. Now, in early January 2009, Manmohan Singh was the prime minister of India, obviously, but he was also the finance minister at that point of time. Now, he had to go in for an operation, and Pranab Mukherjee became the finance minister. And he stayed the finance minister up until 2012. And his mandate to public sector banks was to continue lending, and to lend at a very, very fast pace. So while lending all across the world was slowing down, India was still lending a lot of money to corporates so that they could expand, so that they could start new projects, and in the process, the economy would revive itself. What also happened was that, along with a very strong public sector bank lending, the government was spending a lot of money. Now, what happens is, I mean, if you've ever studied economics, you would know that one of the most famous economists, or probably the most famous economist of the 20th century, was a gentleman called John Maynard Keynes. And John Maynard Keynes studied the Great Depression of 1929. And he came up with this concept called the paradox of thrift, or the paradox of saving. What he said was that what works for an individual doesn't necessarily work at the level of the society. So when an individual saves more, it makes sense for the individual. But when the society as a whole saves more, there is a problem, because ultimately one man's spending is another man's income. And when everyone is saving, who's spending? And if people are not spending, and then obviously incomes fall and jobs are lost and so on and so forth. So what Keynes said was that, in an environment where economic growth is contracting or the economic growth is slow, the private sector, the individuals, the private companies are not spending money. So in this situation, the government needs to come out and spend a lot of money. And so this obviously, this philosophy has been fairly popular among politicians across generations since Keynes first made it in 1936. So something similar happened in India, between 2009 and 2011, when the government also spent a lot of money in order to sort of prime the economy. And it helped. In 2010-11, the economic growth was greater than 10%. is the only time that the Indian economy has grown at greater than 10%. And this was when, the world at large was growing at 1, 2, and 3%. India was growing at 10%, primarily because of all the government spending and all the overlending by public sector banks. Now, obviously, all good stories come to an end, or, as they say, if it's too good to be true, it probably isn't. And that's what happened. And sometime in 2010-11, the two things that happened. The first thing that happened was that a lot of projects for which promoters had borrowed never really started off. They never took off, and they did not take off primarily because of a lot of reasons. I mean, India has always had a lot of red tapeism and bureaucracy, and so the projects got stuck in that. Land clearances were not given. Then there were environmental clearances which didn't come through. There were other non-environmental clearances which didn't come through. There were policy issues. Promoters could not put in enough money. So essentially, what happened was that, here was this promoter who had borrowed a lot of money in order to get a project going, but the project was stuck, and it wasn't throwing up. He wasn't making any money out of that project, but he still had to repay that loan. Also, because of the government spending so much money, and because of the government spending so much money and the public sector banks pumping in a whole host of money into the economy started seeing double-digit inflation. It first started with food inflation, and then food inflation seeped into all other kinds of inflation. Inflation is essentially the rate of price rise. Now, what happened is when inflation started, becoming higher than 10%, obviously the interest rates also had to go up. So the interest rates also became more than 10, 11%. And in a scenario where the businessman was not making any money from the project that he had borrowed against, he had to pay an interest of 10 and 11%, which was huge. So he was obviously not in a position to sort of pay either that interest or that loan. Now, so by 2011, it was very clear that a lot of these loans, which the banks, public sector banks in particular, had given, would be defaulted on. Now, so obviously, if that was the case, the defaults should have started as in 2011, or if not in 2011, in 2012. But the defaults did not start at that point of time. Now, what happened was that the Reserve Bank of India started to practice something called as regulatory forbearance. Now, regulatory forbearance is nothing but a very complicated term for saying it decided to look the other way. So what happened was that banks started evergreening their loans. Now, what does evergreening mean? It means that, let's say you are a borrower, and you're a large borrower, and you're not in a position to repay a loan. So what the bank does is it gives you a fresh loan so that you can repay the older loan, and then you can worry about the newer loan later. So that's called evergreening. Now, this is nothing but the Minsky's third stage, or the Ponzi stage of finance, where a borrower, in order to repay a loan, needs to take on a fresh loan. So this also answers the question as to why a bank would give a loan to a borrower who is not in a position to repay the loan, because there's this old saying, and I start my book with it, and let me just get it out. Okay, so this is something that's attributed to John Maynard Keynes. So Keynes had apparently once said, if you owe your bank £100, you have a problem. But if you owe your bank £1 million, it has. The Economist magazine had a modern day version of it, and which said that if you owe your bank £1 billion, everybody has a problem. So when someone owes a bank a lot of money, allowing him to default is not a very good option. And you want to sort of postpone that problem as much as you can. So one of the ways of postponing it is giving out a fresh loan, so that the old loan can be repaid. And then, you basically hope that something might happen and he might be able to repay the fresh loan. The other thing that started to happen at a massive level was restructuring of loans. Now, restructuring of loans essentially means, what it means is that, the bank and the bankers on a case-to-case basis decide whether to sort of lower the interest rate on a loan, or to sort of give the borrower some time in between, so that you give him some time, and during that time you tell him, okay, you don't have to repay the principal part during this period, so that he can then use that money for something else and hopefully revive his business. So all these kind of things happened, and they kept happening up until late 2014, early 2015. The first time the RBI publicly acknowledged that there was a problem with the Indian banking system and bad loans was in November 2014, when Dr. Raghuram Rajan, who was the governor of the RBI at that point of time, made a speech at the Varghese Kurian Memorial Lecture at the Institute of Rural Management in Anand. And in that speech, he called out many big businessmen, he called out lawyers, and he basically said, we have a problem, which we are not talking about, which we aren't even, wanting to say that it exists. So finally, sometime in 2015, mid-2015, the Reserve Bank started something known as the Asset Quality Review. So asset quality review, basically what happened with this asset quality review was that the banks, largely public sector banks, were forced to acknowledge their bad loans as bad loans. I mean, up until then, they had been kicking the can down the road by restructuring or by evergreening their loans. And this is when the real picture of bad loans of Indian banks started to come out. Sometime in 2015, but it's just something that should have happened sometime as early as 2011. Now, Dr. Rajan, left the RBI in 2016. He was replaced by Dr. Urjit Patel. Under Urjit Patel, the cleaning of bad loans of public sector banks continued. Urjit Patel also sort of, left, and as I said, as of now, the bad loans of Indian public sector bank stand at close to 9 lakh crore. Now, there are two questions. The first thing is, when will these bad loans go away? Now, what happens is that, any loan which has been a bad loan. Now, what happens is when a loan is categorized as a bad loan, the bank has to put aside a certain amount of money in order to face any losses on account of that bad loan. So in the first year, if let's say the bad loan is 100 rupees, the bank has to set aside 15 rupees to meet any losses arising because of that bad loan. And by the time any bad loan has spent 4 years on a balance sheet, 100% of that loan, money is set aside for 100% of that loan. So what happens is after 4 years, a bad loan can be dropped from the balance sheet of a bank. Okay. And so we are in 2019, okay, 2020. And a bulk of our bad loans were recognized by 2018. So a bad loan which was recognized as a bad loan in 2018 would have spent 4 years on the balance sheet of banks by 2022. And then it can be dropped and the balance sheet can sort of become cleaner. The problem is that now we have we have COVID, and there will be a new generation of bad loans which will start accumulating. And this time, okay, so the last time what happened was that a bulk of the bad loans was because of default by industry, default by large corporates, which is why the Indian banking crisis was not at all similar to the subprime crisis of 2007, 2008. In case of the subprime crisis, what happened was that borrowers, sorry, I'll just have some water. Okay. So, what is prime and what is subprime? Prime borrowers are essentially borrowers which the banks want. They know that these are the guys who you give a loan to, and these are the guys who repay that loan. But there are only certain number of prime borrowers going around. So if you want to expand your banking business, you have to ultimately start giving loans to risky customers, people who are not in a position to repay your loan. These are subprime guys. So you end up giving loans to subprime guys who are not in a position to repay your loan. So the subprime crisis was very different because subprime was a very retail crisis. American banks ended up giving home loans to subprime customers who were really not in a position to repay that loan. Now, why did they take that risk? They took that risk because what used to happen in America was something called as securitization. Now, what used to happen during in securitization was, let's say there are different kinds of home loans. A bank would take all those home loans and sell those home loans to someone else. They would sell those home loans to an investment bank like Lehman Brothers, and then it would become Lehman Brothers' problem and not the bank's problem. So, which is why when the subprime defaults, when these guys who actually should not have gotten the loan in the first place started to default on their home loans, the banks which had given out the home loans did not end up in trouble, but the investment banks which had bought these home loans from the banks which had given out the home loans ended up in a lot of trouble. So anyway, so their problem, the problem in the US and in the UK and large parts of Europe was retail banking. In the Indian case, the problem was corporate banking. The corporates defaulted, the retail crowd never really defaulted. But post-COVID, I mean, with so many people losing jobs, so many small and medium enterprises shutting down, the problem will be more at the retail level and at the small business level. Now, once these guys start defaulting, and now these defaults will start hitting the balance sheets of banks only early next year. Why is that? So, RBI essentially announced a moratorium between March and August. That moratorium ended on August 31st. But right now, the case is on in the Supreme Court. And anyway, once the Supreme Court decides, only after that, the bad loans can be can be registered as bad loans. Now, as you know, bad loans, for a loan to be categorized as a bad loan, it has to be defaulted on for a period of 90 days. So if someone sort of defaults on a loan as of today, which is 1st October, it will be recognized as a bad loan only on the 1st of January. And a loan which has been recognized as a bad loan on the 1st of January will be declared in the quarterly result of the period January to March 2021. And this result is, will more or less be declared towards the end of April 2021 or early May 2021. So the problems of banks because of the spread of the COVID pandemic will only start coming to the fore in sometime in the middle of next year. So we've sort of, like, we managed to kick the can down the road in 2011. We've already started doing that in this case now. So this was basically all I wanted to talk about bad loans. Now I want to talk about the fact that why there is no free lunch in economics. I mean, you and I might, when I sort of started talking about bad loans, or when I started writing about bad loans, almost 6-7 years back, a lot of people used to come to me and tell me, but how is that my problem? I mean, it's a bank's problem, the bank will handle it. It is not a bank's problem. It is basically your problem. It is, all of us are involved with this problem. How? So look at a lot of these public sector banks. Okay, there have been so many defaults on their loan side. But despite those defaults, the public sector banks have never defaulted, or even a private bank for that matter, has never defaulted on a fixed deposit. Now, how does banking work? Banking basically works, the bankers solicit deposits, they pay a certain rate of interest on those deposits, and then they lend that money out as loans at a higher rate of interest. Now, as long as the loans are being repaid, the deposits will be repaid, because that's what, that's the money that the bank has. I mean, the bank is basically a financial intermediator. And obviously it makes a profit at, it lends probably, let's say it borrows at, it borrows an FD at 6% and it gives out a home loan at 9%. So 3%, let's say, is the margin, and in that margin, the bank has to meet its expenses. It has to pay its employees. It has to pay its off-roll staff. It has to basically pay rents and all other expenses. And then what remains is the profit for the bank. Now, if loans are defaulted on, I mean, then the entire part of the deposit cannot be repaid. So let me give you the example of IDBI Bank. The bad loans of IDBI Bank peaked at close to 32%. Now, what does that mean? That basically means that close to 1/3 of the loans of the bank had been defaulted on. But despite 1/3 of the loans of the bank being defaulted on, deposits were never defaulted on. Okay. So what was happening here? Now, what was happening here is that the government, as the owner of these banks, was constantly putting money into these banks. Now, the question is, the next question that you need to ask yourself is, where does the government get its money from? I mean, the government does not have it can't create money out of thin air. The government gets its money from taxes. So when the government keeps putting money into banks to ensure that they don't go bust, it obviously is not putting that money somewhere else. I mean, that money could have easily gone into agriculture, it could have gone into education, it could have gone into public health, it could have gone into defense. I mean, India's defense budget as a percentage of its GDP hasn't gone up in many, many years. So there is clearly, someone is paying a cost for it. Obviously, that someone does not realize that he or she is paying for it. The other thing that happened, and this is again something very subtle that most people don't realize, banks essentially, what do banks, what is the profit that banks make? The profit is essentially the rate of interest they pay on the deposits and the rate of interest they charge on their loans. So the difference is the profit. Now, how do you increase that profit? You increase that profit by ensuring that the interest on deposits falls at a faster rate than the interest on loans, right? So the banks started to play around with that margin, and a lot of so what that essentially means is that the depositors got a lower rate of interest, and the borrowers ended up paying a higher rate of interest. Obviously, most people do not realize this. The third, and I think this is by far the most important part, and it doesn't get talked about at all. So before I sort of logged in for this talk, I checked the market capitalization of the State Bank of India. Now, State Bank of India is the largest public sector bank. It is also the largest bank in India. The market capitalization of State Bank of India is 1.7 lakh crore. Now, compare it to Kotak Mahindra Bank. Okay, Kotak Mahindra Bank is a puny. It's a small bank in front of SBI. SBI has assets of close to 42 lakh crore, whereas the assets of Kotak Mahindra Bank are at around 4 lakh crore. The market capitalization of Kotak Mahindra Bank is 2.58 lakh crore. It is 88,000 crore more than the market capitalization of the State Bank of India. Why is that the case? That is the case because the stock market and the stock market investors know that Kotak Mahindra Bank is a bank which will be run like a bank, whereas that guarantee is not there in case of a State Bank of India. To give you another example, the market capitalization of HDFC Bank is much more than the market capitalization of all public sector banks put together. Okay. Now, this is the real cost of bad loans of public sector banks. And why is this a cost? I mean, you might come around to me and tell me, okay, but public sector enterprise, the market cap doesn't matter. What matters is social objectives and so on and so forth. Now I'll explain why market capitalization matters as well. Okay. In India, public sector enterprises are, for the last 70 years, have not been run as proper businesses. They are seen as institutions which are businesses at some level, but they also need to meet the social objectives of the government. Now, I think it is important for the government to have social objectives. It's very, very important. But the moment you mix it up with enterprises of the government, you are in for trouble. Now, take the case of, I'll give you a very simple example. There used to be a bank called UTI Bank, which is now known as Axis Bank. UTI Bank, when it was started, it was owned by the ownership was all public sector, but it was run by, it had the license to be run as a private sector bank. And because of that, the bank got the right market capitalization, and the government could sell those shares and make a lot of money. Now, why is this important? So whenever I sort of talk about the fact that businesses, public sector banks need to be run like proper banks and not as something like, which essentially meets the social object as an institution whose main goal is to meet the social objectives of the government, I get a lot of flack for it. But here's the thing, okay? Now, let's say the government wants the bank to run the Jan Dhan Yojana. Okay, now so the State Bank of India opens all these Jan Dhan accounts and does all these low cost banking and all that. But the service that it provides to these customers, if you are a Jan Dhan account holder, and when you go to the bank and you want to carry out some basic banking transaction, the kind of service that you get is absolutely horrible. So let's say the State Bank of India was a properly run bank, and it had, and given that it was a properly run bank, it got the right market capitalization in the stock market. The government could then incentivize all these public sector banks and all the private banks to offer these social services. The government could pay these banks to offer these social services, and the banks, in order to make that money, would happily sort of provide those services and provide a certain level of service as well. And because the banks had the right amount of, or were getting the right market capitalization, all the government needed to do was to sell some shares every year and earn that money. Now, you might say that, this is, an idea of one guy sitting in a room, but the world doesn't work like that. But, I would like to read out something from a recent book written by a gentleman called R.C. Bhargav. R.C. Bhargav, as you would know, is the chairman of Maruti Suzuki, India's largest car maker. He was also, for a very, very long period of time, at least I think for 25 years, he was also an IAS officer. So he's seen both the sides. So from 1956 to 1981, he was an IAS officer. And I think since then, he's been associated with Maruti Suzuki. And he writes this in his latest book, Getting Competitive. The USSR was the pioneer in attempting industrialization along with creating a communist society. It did not succeed. On the other hand, Japan became a highly competitive and industrialized nation and has a high degree of equality and social justice. The policies for regulating and promoting industrial growth do not have any social content in them. Social equality was a result of the political and industrial leadership understanding that manufacturing competitiveness would be enhanced if there was greater equality and the bulk of the people were enabled to become consumers of manufactured goods. Now, this is not me saying it. This is a former IAS officer saying it. So I think it is very, very important for the government to sort of take a back seat and let public sector banks be run as proper businesses. You may privatize, you may not privatize them. I'm not getting into that argument, but you need to let public sector banks be run as a proper business, and then you can incentivize the social justice part of it, the social service part of it, the social objective part of it, because then they'll get the right market capitalization, and the government can then keep selling these shares gradually, and and make things happen instead of doing what it is currently. There are a few other things. If you look at a lot of these public sector banks, they are some of these banks are very small, and the smaller banks, I think, need to concentrate on on the small, need to concentrate on the retail part of business. Every bank need not get into corporate lending, because a lot of these smaller public sector banks, or even the larger public sector banks for that matter, do not have the expertise that is necessary to give out corporate loans, to give out loans for long gestation projects. So, bank like a Bank of Maharashtra, which has got very good penetration all across Maharashtra, should concentrate on giving out retail loans. It should concentrate on giving out small business loans. It should concentrate on becoming the bank of the local community. It shouldn't try, to give loans for large projects, large infrastructure projects, power projects, so on and so forth. It does not have the necessary expertise to do so. So that sort of, I think, limitation wherein a public sector bank concentrates on a particular area is also a great idea. I think this is all I had to say. I mean, I'm open to taking questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kaul. That was as lucid as it could be. The whole expanse of the way we started distributing loans, what went wrong, both at the level of governance as well as the micromanagement of the banks and the role of the state. And the way you ended up with explaining that why we should have a framework for new public management and banks should be run as banks. Thank you so much for so lucid and clear presentation. I would invite questions. It would be better if you can put in chat, but if they're pressing and very precise question, it may be also spoken. But I request all of you to be very brief and to the point.
Okay, where can I see the...
I'll come back to you with the questions, don't worry. I'll read the chat and come back to you.
Oh, okay.
Saket, you go ahead, but be very brief.
All right, sir. Sir, so you talked about efficiency of public sector banks and how the shares of public sector banks should be sold to private individuals. Isn't that argument somewhere down the line is quite similar to privatization of public sector banks?
Okay, yeah. It is. And I'll tell you why it is important to do this. Now, if you look at data, public sector banks had 75% of the loan market in 2010. Okay. In 2020, it is down to 57%. Now, what is happening is that irrespective of whether the government privatizes these banks or not, the banking sector is getting privatized. Okay. So it is important that, so if you don't want the banking sector to go the way of the aviation sector or the telecom sector, wherein even though the government did not privatize these sectors, they automatically got privatized. And in the process, the government lost a lot of money, and that money could have done this country a whole lot of good. I mean, look at BSNL or look at MTNL. These were large organizations at once upon a time. BSNL still is. MTNL has gone down the drain. Look at what has happened to Air India. So if you want to avoid getting into that situation where your government institutions essentially become useless, then this is the only way out without privatizing them. So at one go.
So I have a follow-up question. You can
no, we'll come back to the follow-up in the second round. Let's first, Krishna, be very brief.
Hello, sir. Sir, this is Krishna here, sir, from School of Public Policy, Tata Institute of Social Science. So, as you mentioned about the asset reconstruction companies. So, earlier we saw in 2015 and 16, we come up with a strategic debt restructuring that are being done by the private company in order to convert those debt into equity. And then in 2017, in economic survey, we come up that the public sector, public asset rehabilitation agency should come up and structure the whole bad loans, and how it can be done. Like it should be privatized or it should be public, and how the bank should restructure, should adhere to the Basel Accord because we are looking towards the balance sheet. No one is looking towards the
one question. No, don't
okay.
ask me a PhD thesis.
Okay.
Ask me a simple, which I can answer.
Okay, sir.
I'll answer. Okay. So see, here's the thing. The reason that para, I mean, which is basically the bad bank idea, that did not take off because see, here's the thing. Let's say the bad bank is a government-owned institution. Okay. Now the problem there is when you get an asset there, right? I mean, there is no way you can sell that asset for a full price, right? You're basically trying to recover as much as you can. Now, do you think a government employee is going to sell something at a lower price and then invite, the courts might come after him, the vigilance department might come after him? So that sort of went down the drain there only. Now, let's say it was privately owned. The problem again with it being privately owned was the fact that if it was privately owned, it would want to buy all these bad loans from public sector banks at a discount again, right? Now, which public sector banker was going to sell bad loans at a discount? So the incentive was, a problem, and which is why it sort of never really took off. So having said that, which is why, if you look at the insolvency and the bankruptcy code, at least the way it was envisaged, and I mean, I don't say that it's the best thing that has happened and there are no problems with it. There are lots of problems with it. But, there are two things that it has done. The first thing it has done is it's put the fear of God in the private entrepreneurs, because that, you can lose your company. Okay, the bank may not recover anything. As they say in Urdu, ki hum to doobenge sanam, tumko bhi le doobenge. So to that extent, that thing works. The second thing is, if you look at a lot of these bigger recoveries, look at, I'll give you 2-3 examples. So if you look at Essar Steel, Essar Steel defaulted around 49,000 crore, Arcelor bought it for 42,000 crore. So recovery of close to 80%. Look at Bhushan Steel, 56,000 crore. Recovery of 35,000 crore, around 63%. Now, these recoveries would have never happened in the past. If you look at the recovery rates, they're like, 10%, 12%, 15%. Now, here you're talking about bulk recoveries of 65%, 80%. Now, obviously, these are not, I mean, there are very few examples of these kind. But the bigger thing that has happened in case of the biggest thing that has happened in case of the IBC is that a lot of entrepreneurs who did not want their companies to go to IBC, to the bankruptcy court, have ended up paying banks. And this is not something that gets talked about enough because if you don't go to the IBC, nobody really notices. So it gets stuck somewhere in between. So I think IBC was a great thing which was started with great noble intentions, but now with COVID and even before that, with the slowdown, a lot of its powers were taken away. I think that should sort of, as we sort of go into the years to come, if that comes back, that it will be a good thing. Because see, if you look at some of the best economies in the world, there are two things. One is it's very easy to start a company, and two, it is very easy to shut down a company also. You need to, if a company is failing, you need to let it fail. And especially in a country like India, which is where we do not have enough capital, where we do not have enough resources, so that those resources can be redeployed. Now, if you look at something like a Bhushan Steel, it could have gone on, here, there, but because Tata Steel has been brought in, so many jobs were saved, first and foremost, so much money was recovered. I mean, all that would have never happened. So you need to let a company, which is why it's important for systems to evolve and for systems to work, which doesn't happen in India.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I'll just give you some questions from the chat. One is, the first to start with this, are there any good institutional practices from across the globe which can manage NPAs?
Yes, so as I just said, you need to have a bankruptcy court, and you need to have you need that to function well. Now, this is something that doesn't happen overnight. I mean, it takes years and years and decades for a system to evolve. And in an Indian case, the problem is even before something starts, we sort of, get around to pulling it down. So if you look at, if you look at US, you look at Europe, the bankruptcy courts all function very, very well. I think that was, when it happened in 2016, 2017, I thought that was one genuine reform, and that is something that we need to continue with.
Amol wants to know whether getting LIC to take over a bank, how good the practice it is, and will it not put at risk millions of depositors who are in LIC?
I think that was a terrible thing to do, because see, you need to understand that LIC may be owned by the government, but the money that it has is not the government's money. It is the money of lakhs of savers of India who have trusted that institution and have given it that money. Now, every time IDBI Bank makes losses, LIC has to put fresh money into that bank. Where does that money come from? It essentially comes from all the premium that all the policy holders are paying, right? Now, if those premiums are going down the drain, obviously, the return on LIC policies will also come down. So again, as I said, there is no free lunch. Someone's paying for it, and the LIC policy holders are paying for it. The tragedy is that they don't know that they're paying for it. I think it was a terrible, terrible thing to sell a bank to LIC. So,
Dr. Sadhu Khan, you seems to have a question.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, Mr. Kaul. I teach economics at the department, so I have probably lots of questions I have to address sometimes, related things with the class that graduate students we have. I have with specific kind of questions that I'll be placing it to get from you and for our students. Basically, there's some theoretical understanding as follows. You have made a very good point that banking sector, where government is playing a role, has reasonable kind of dilemma or trade-off between the public responsibilities, right? On the other hand, being an entrepreneur or enterprise, right? So it's a business, and on the other hand, you have to place a public responsibility, right? Now, this is a very important thing for our department, actually. We do lots of public policy, such business and public, that is the trade-off. Now, here I'm giving you one example of the current interest rates on three different categories. One is the interest rate for gold. If you take a gold, if you purchase gold, for which you would be getting interest rate from the biggest bank, SBI, that is 7.5%. For getting a four-wheeler, you'll be getting that thing by 7.75%. For a home, this is 6.95%. But for education, it is nearly 3 percentage points higher, 9.3%. Right?
Right. So, you want me to answer the question?
That and education, okay, and having that. This is the question I'm placing to you now. Here, as a banker, what would be your justification or theorization to justify higher interest rate for education when you are a public, say, it's a government or the public government policy makers having the target of social responsibility? Then what would be your take? Third is that what would be the social kind of outcome that we'll be trying to get out of this higher interest rate on education, which is one of the biggest debt in US, okay? Well, few $1 trillion, that's my question. If you can place some answer, so that would be great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you.
So see, here's the thing. Why do you think the interest rate on a home loan is 6.95%? Because the risk is the least. You cannot run away with your home anywhere, right? Why do you think the interest rate on a two-wheeler is, as you said, some 7.75% or something? I mean, you can run away with your two-wheeler, but the bank at least has some chance of sort of catching you and getting that two-wheeler and selling it and recovering the loan. The problem with an education loan is that many people who take on education loans, do not end up repaying it. And I mean, now at least the systems are very strong. Earlier, what used to happen was people would study at IIMs and people would study at IITs, take on an education loan, and then go abroad, make money in dollars, and default on the education loan here. So, which is why, because the defaults are high, people who end up repaying the loans, education loans, end up also paying for people who default on these loans. So this is the business part of it. Now, obviously, this creates a problem for genuine candidates who need an education loan, and they end up paying a higher rate of interest. So, as I said, the way out here is that the government needs to have an interest subvention scheme, wherein let's say the rate of education loan is 9%, and they need to pay around 1/3 of the interest. Let's say they pay 3%, and the 6% is paid by the person who's taking on that loan. Now, this is only going to happen when the government has enough money to do these things. Right now, it doesn't have enough money to do it, and then it wants public sector banks to run such schemes, which are there on paper, but when you go to them for such a loan, they'll give you a runaround of your lifetime and essentially ensure that they don't give you that loan. So
yeah, thank you. So there are two related questions. One is that why we don't make an issue about the agriculture sector loan, to what extent it constrains the banking sector. And a similar related question is that priority sector lending is almost 40%.
But see, okay. So, agriculture, I guess the defaults are not as high as corporates. So, I mean, you have to be thankful to farmers to, at least ensure that they repay loans. The problem with agriculture is not with the farmers. The problem with agriculture is that what has happened over the last few years is that if you're fighting a state election, it is important. It is now a hygiene factor that, one of the first things you say that is the farm loans will be waived off. Okay. Now, what happens is when you do such things, obviously this signal that the farmer is taking is that the average farmer is taking is that, this is free money, and this is money that does not have to be returned. So I think the problem is more at a political level and not at the farmer level. The second, what was the second question? The second question was
priority sector lending.
Priority sector. See, you should actually go down. You should essentially see what all is included in that priority sector lending. Even home loans are now priority sector lending. So it doesn't really, priority sector lending doesn't mean what it used to mean, some 30 years back. So, I mean, if home loans are priority sector lending, what else is remaining then? So, priority sector is no longer priority sector. It's just a category which is there and it's there. So, you cannot really remove it. So.
Hi, Kishore. You want to go next?
Am I audible?
Yes, Kishore. Yeah.
Hi. I had a question, a small clarification, and you mentioned that the market capitalization of the small banks like Kotak Mahindra and HDFC are much higher than.
Oh, HDFC is not a small bank, my dear.
No. In the sense, smaller than
SBI.
SBI.
Okay.
Yeah. So you mentioned that it is much higher for these banks than SBI. So I wanted to know that what does it actually mean by when we say market capitalization? Okay. Does this money actually go into actual contribution to the economy, or is it just a kind of instruments that are used?
I got your question. I got your question.
Yeah, yeah.
So see, what does market capitalization mean? Market capitalization means that every company has a certain number of shares. Okay.
Yeah.
And those shares have a certain price. So if you multiply the number of shares with the share price, you get market capitalization. Now, what is that market capitalization? The market capitalization is essentially a number which all the investors expect. It is essentially the total amount of earnings, that the investors expect that the particular bank or that particular company will make in the time to come. It's the discounted value of that. Okay. Now, what it means is, what it essentially means is when the market cap of State Bank is lower than that of Kotak Mahindra Bank, what it means is that the investors essentially expect Kotak Mahindra Bank to make much more money than SBI, even though SBI is a much bigger bank. Okay, that is what it means. Now, why it hurts is because ultimately all these shares are essentially currency for the government. If it wants to spend money, let's say it wants to, it wants to spruce up our defense systems, right? Right now, it doesn't have that kind of money. But if it wants to spruce up our defense systems and at the same time, all these public sector units are well-run businesses, which then obviously have a higher market capitalization, then these shares can gradually be sold and that money can be used for social good. So which is how you lose out.
But with privatization, that won't happen.
No. So I'm not. So which is why I'm saying, see, privatization. No. I mean, even with privatization, I mean, the best example, as I said, is Axis Bank. Axis Bank was a public sector bank in ownership, run as a private bank. And over the years, if you look at the kind of money the government has made out of it, I mean, it runs into thousands of crores. And so all that is needed now is that, here's the thing. I can understand that you cannot sell State Bank of India. I mean, I get that, right? You cannot sell a Bank of Baroda. You cannot sell Punjab National Bank. These are big banks, right? But I don't see any reason for the government to run an Indian overseas bank. There is no reason the government should be running an Indian overseas bank, or there is no reason the government should have been running Dena Bank, right? So these are these small banks. So either you limit their, mandate wherein they do good retail lending, because retail lending is also very, very necessary, right? They do good retail lending. They lend to small businesses and specialize in their own local area, right? Or you just, for the amount of money that they have sucked out over the years, the kind of things the government could have been doing is humongous. So you can either sell them, you can shut them down, but let them not keep taking money from the system like they used to, is my limited argument. Whether you choose to privatize them, whether you choose to shut them down, it's your money, you decide on that. But you cannot let these banks continue sucking out money. I mean, IDBI Bank taking money from LIC policy holders. My blood boils when I think about it.
I see. I get your point.
Yeah. And Vivek, this will be a very favorite of yours. Why is Sensex performing in spite of such huge NPAs?
What is?
Why is Sensex performing so well in spite of?
No, I mean, see, I think people have this huge misconception that the Sensex has been performing well. And I'll tell you why. The Sensex has performed well since March. If you look at the 10-year return of Sensex, 10-year return of Sensex, or if you look at 10-year return of Nifty, which is another big index, it's close to around 8%, which is not huge. If you look at, returns of 5 years or 3 years or something, you would have been better off in a fixed deposit. In fact, if you look at 3-year returns, you would have even been better off in savings bank account. So this is a huge misconception people have that stocks have done well. Stocks have done well in the last 6 months, not over a longish 10-year period.
Thanks. I'll just take, if you can just do 2 or 3 more questions.
We can go on. I mean, I'm fine. I have time.
Okay. See. So there's a question of one of our graduate students that how do you think this moratorium is any of use, because the economy is not functioning. Eventually you have to pay it back. So how this moratorium on loans?
I think, here's the thing, when COVID really, broke out, nobody really knew which way it would go. So I think in a way it was good that the RBI offered everyone some time. I mean, I have no problem with that. But now it's gone on for too long. I mean, we are in the 8th month now. I mean, obviously, the moratorium is no longer on, but there is a case going on in the Supreme Court. And if you follow that case, it's very, very interesting. So one of the, presentations made in front of the court has come from the real estate sector. Okay. Now, the real estate sector has asked the court that the interest on the loan amount during the moratorium should be limited to the interest the banks are paying on fixed deposits. Now, what does that mean? What that means is, let's say you have 1 lakh rupees. You have a loan of 1 lakh rupees on which which is in a moratorium. Now, obviously, for that 6 months, whatever interest that you haven't paid will be added onto your outstanding loan, and then you will repay that loan. So what the real estate sector is telling the court is that that interest should be limited to the fixed deposit interest rate. Now, here's the point. If that interest is limited just to the fixed deposit interest rate, how will the bank meet its other expenses? As I said, the bank doesn't have only expenses, are not just interest that it pays on FDs. Also, more importantly, and here's the larger philosophical point is this. What is interest on a loan? Interest on a loan is basically the price of money. Okay. When I deposit money in a fixed deposit, what am I doing? I'm basically giving my money to the bank. I'm not consuming that money right away. I'm giving it to the bank so that the bank can then lend it on to someone else. So if the courts today decide on the price of money, tomorrow they can also decide on the price of real estate. Someone then can approach the court citing this judgment and say that, all these real estate companies haven't been repaying bank loans. And in order to repay bank loans, they need to sort of cut the prices of their homes. So, I mean, this is just full on rubbish, which is essentially going on. I mean, you cannot compromise the health of your banking system. I mean, I can understand that there is a need to handle the situation delicately and not, run riot with it. But saying something like the banks need to charge, the interest on a loan should be equal to the interest on fixed deposit. I mean, that is rubbish of the worst kind. So.
Okay, thanks. There is another question which slightly away from what you're discussing with, but it says that there's a deposit insurance scheme which has been raised from 1 lakh to 5 lakh. Will it anywhere be a security to the depositors?
I mean, if you're, see, here's the thing. Okay, now I'll also answer the question that you had originally asked, because that's the right part. That is money in bank safe? Okay. Here's the thing, I don't think the question to ask is money in bank safe? That is not for you and I to decide. The question to ask is, which bank should I put my money in? Okay. Now, I'll give you a very simple example. So take a bank like Yes Bank. Okay. Yes Bank failed recently. It was put under a moratorium, and then there was a bailout arranged, and things are now all back to normal. But let's say during that moratorium, you needed money. Let's say there is a health emergency in the family. Then what do you do? Where do you go? Money, see, one of the most important factors of money is not whether, obviously it is important that money is safe. But the second most important factor about money is whether it is accessible at all points of time, at points when I need it the most. So if anyone had any, if they had been following the news cycle even remotely, they would have known that Yes Bank is not a bank you bank with. And they would have removed the money. Now, similarly, look at a bank like IDBI Bank, or look at Indian Overseas Bank, or look at Central Bank. Now, these are banks with very, very high NPA ratios. Okay. Now, people continue to bank with these banks because they feel, okay, the government is behind the bank and they won't let a bank fail, which is true. No government will let a public sector bank fail. In fact, no government will let a private bank fail also. But then again, this is not the right attitude, because, what if the bank is put under a moratorium? Then what do you do? And again, if you want to sort of deal with public sector banks, what is stopping you from dealing with a good public sector bank like a State Bank of India? How is the service at, Central Bank of India, or a United Bank of India, or a whatever, or a Indian Overseas Bank better than the service at SBI? I mean, okay, there may be a local branch where people know you and they probably indulge you a little more. But is that is that worth the trouble? So the basic point I make is that if you are banking with a bank which has an NPA, which has a bad loan rate of more than 10%, I mean, you are putting your money at risk. And it's not like that bank is giving you any extra facility, or it's not that they're paying you 3% more interest. You know, the rate of interest is same across public sector banks. Probably one bank will give you 25 basis point, 0.25% more, right? So I think it's very, very important to be very sure of the bank you're banking with. Keep a track of the bad loans rate. It is not very difficult. Every 3 months, the bank comes up, when they declare the result, they come up with a PowerPoint presentation, which is freely available on their website. All you need to do is go there, click on it, download it, and check for their gross non-performing assets. That is all that is required. On the flip side, now take a look at what happened to, in Bombay, we have this bank called the Punjab and Maharashtra Cooperative Bank, PMC Bank. Now, PMC, I mean, the name Punjab is there in it, but the bank doesn't have any branches in Punjab. So it is primarily a bank of the Sikh community in Mumbai, okay, in Bombay. And the bank was put under a moratorium. It's still under a moratorium. It's been almost, I think, 2 years now. And there have been so many stories that the local tabloids keep publishing about how, people needed money for a medical emergency, but they could only withdraw up to 1 lakh. Marriages, people needed money to get their children married. So you have to be very careful. And the problem with a lot of these cooperative banks is that there is not enough information out there. And there are thousands of cooperative banks. So, you don't know. I mean, I can understand you having some money in a cooperative bank because it's next to where you stay. But you can't have 50 lakhs in a cooperative bank and then tomorrow, keep wondering, "Arey, mera pura paisa phas gaya." So you have to be very, very careful with which bank you bank with, irrespective of whether, the deposit insurance is 1 lakh, 5 lakh or 10 lakh.
Saket, very quickly to you, very briefly.
Sir, I wanted to ask you, how do you ensure public accountability of all these banks, A? And what is the
public accountability of what?
Of all these banks? When especially at a time when we are moving towards mass privatization of banks, A, and how do you see the role of public credit registry in ensuring it?
So public credit registry is, I think it's a good idea. And in fact, one of the first things that happened under Dr. Raghuram Rajan under the RBI is that the public sector banks started sharing data. So up until then, they didn't even share data. So what used to happen was that there was this guy, let's say one businessman, whose loan had been categorized as a bad loan at one bank, but another bank, which was a part of, the same loan syndication, which had given the loan to the businessman, had still not declared it a bad loan. So at some level, at first level, that integration has to happen. Okay? So once that integration is thorough, only then can we have a public credit registry, right? So it's a good idea. I mean, I'm all for it. Public accountability is a tricky question, yeah. I mean, it's not. I really don't know. I mean, I haven't thought about it, and I wouldn't want to give you an offhand answer, pretending to know that I know, but I don't. So, sorry about that.
I assume all good things, as Vivek earlier said in his banking lecture, have come to an end at some point of time. I think you would have been a wonderful teacher.
That's another story for another day. I wanted to become a teacher, and I started doing my PhD as well. And then there was so much politics that I just couldn't take it. So I said, it's better to become a journalist and a writer than trying to complete a PhD.
Great service to the country by writing such new system. Ipsita, you want to just step in and say?
Thanks.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Vivek Kaul, for this very informative and more importantly, very relatable, talk, So I'm so glad that you haven't done your PhD, because then you would have started speaking in ways which would be very inaccessible to, people like me with very little idea about banking. Because honestly, I feel that academic writing, I know that Kishore, Kishore will differ with me on that, but I have found that, one of the problems with, the fact that we don't understand society, economy, politics better, because we, the academics, write in such a complex manner that even simple things appear to be far more complicated. And yet here, you, I think, presented some of the most complex political ideas in a very, very accessible manner. So thank you. Thanks a lot for that.
thank you, ma'am. Thank you for having me.
And thanks a lot for all the sensible advices that you gave on banking. I was actually making my own notes and I was thinking about, okay, where have I put my money? And, oh, I have to think about it. I thought about my father's pension and, why is this pension lying in central bank? I have to do something about it. So it was that, one could connect with, your immediate life. One thing I would just respond to the students when you spoke about the loan waiver, you have touched on that. Perhaps you could see the many times the amount of corporate waiver that we are giving, and and compare it with the farm waivers. Mr.
I can
Paul.
answer that. I can answer that question. Okay, in fact, good. It's a very good question. So here's
Right.
the thing. Okay, see, I can answer your question in a simple way. I'll first answer it in a simple way, and then I'll give you the long answer.
Vivek, can I add something to it?
Sure.
It's a very relatable thing. See, when we see a it's not banking straight away, it's a political economy. So it's when we see COVID response way, and most of the countries which have done well in COVID have a very high spending regime. Where in India, we have not spent much. Your proportion of money spent to the GDP is very minuscule. So is it the problem with the banks? Is it the problem with the imagination? Or is it, that's why I just wanted to add that corporate.
Sure. So I'll first answer, Ipshita's question and then I'll come to you.
Yeah.
Ma'am, the simple answer to your question is two wrongs do not make a right. Okay. I think corporate waivers are even worse than agriculture waivers. Okay. But there is a technical point that I would like to make here. And this is something that Arun Jaitley used to do. And I hated him for doing it, but he was right. See, what happens is nobody gives a corporate a loan waiver. Okay. Even though the media tends to use the term very, very loosely, for a corporate, it is never a loan waiver. It is a loan write-off. Okay. Now, and there is a huge difference between a waiver and a write-off. What is a write-off? And I mean, I explained that during my talk, though I didn't use the term write-off. Now, what is a write-off? A bad loan, as I said, is a loan which hasn't been repaid for 90 days. Okay. Once a bad loan has spent 4 years on a balance sheet of the bank can write it off. It can remove it from its balance sheet. Why can it remove it from its balance sheet? Because it has already set aside enough money to take care of the losses arising out of that loan. So if, let's say, the loan is 1,000 crore, the provisions for that loan are also 1,000 crore. So they can write it off. Number one. Having, even if you have written off a loan, now what happens is in India, we have this peculiar thing. The write-off is something called as a technical write-off. Now, what is a technical write-off? What it means is that the loan is written off at the headquarter level of a bank, but it isn't written off at the branch level. So even though the loan is written off, the branch guys have to continue chasing to get the loan repaid. Okay. So theoretically it's this. Now, if you look at evidence, the evidence tells us that, the repayment on, the recovery of a loan which has been written off is from what just give me a minute. I mean, it's there somewhere in my book, but I can't recall the number directly. Anyway, I can't find it. So the recovery, what I'll say in a slightly general terms is that the recovery of loans which have been written off are very, very low. Okay. So, they're less than, they're around 15% or lower. So what that essentially means that, technically we can call it a write-off, but it is as good as a waive-off.
True.
Yeah. So you're right. I mean, the fact that, so many corporates get a write-off, why shouldn't farmers also get? But then, as I said, I mean, these are, two wrongs do not make a right, because ultimately you're playing around with the savings of, millions of Indians, which is something that I would be most worried about. Okay, your question, right? See, here's the problem. Okay, now in 2016, through much of 2016, I sat and wrote this book, which ended up being all of 736 pages, and which nobody really read, probably other than me and my father, who was editing it. And the book was called India's Big Government, the Intrusive State and How It Is Hurting Us. Now, big government, what did I mean by big government? What I meant by big government was that I did not mean that India has a big government which employs a lot of people. In fact, if you look at numbers and compare it with other governments, the Indian government is very, very small when it comes to the number of employees. What I meant by big government was that the Indian government is big in ambition. Okay. So they want to do everything, and because of that, they end up doing nothing. Okay. So what do I mean by they want to do everything? I don't know how many of you know, but the Indian government owns a company which makes condoms. Why in the world
Hindustan Latex.
Hindustan Latex? Huh?
The
Why
same company is going to be used to be making vaccines now.
Now,
Perhaps.
So I mean, why should or very close to where I live in Bombay, there is a company called Bicycle Corporation of India. Okay. So the government has huge ambition, and it's present in almost many areas where it shouldn't. I think the government should basically be concentrating on 7-8 of the most important areas. No, it should be in external affairs, defense, education, health, agriculture, infrastructure. The problem is we have spread ourselves so thin that we cannot concentrate on the most basic areas. Now, this explains to a large extent as to why, across India, the public health infrastructure is largely missing. And some of the numbers that I came across recently are very, very scary. So take a state like Kerala. Kerala and Jharkhand are, they are largely similar in the case that they have the same population, mostly, a similar population. Jharkhand has 6,000 doctors, Kerala has 60,000 doctors. So, so this is the kind of thing that is there. Now, and what has also happened is, to answer, Asim's question, if you look at countries which have spent a lot of money, I mean, you look at all the countries in Europe, primarily, and even in the US, the governments are relatively big, or in comparison to the overall economy. So governments in Europe, if you take a government in France or in Germany, they form almost 50% of the economy. In the US, the government is around 1/3 of the economy. In India, it's around 15%. So there is no money to spend. And because we have sort of spread ourselves so wide, so thin, that, even when you want to sort of concentrate and spend on what you should actually be spending money on, you can't.
Thanks, Ikshita.
Yeah. So thank you once again for adding on to this and addressing one core issues which often comes up in these discussions. And I think you did perfect justice to the topic that there are no free lunches, and I think it helped us to connect the dots very well between when we are talking about these largesses, where are we, who is actually paying for it? So thank you so much for again illustrating that so very, very clearly. Thank you very much for your time. And I also would like to put on record my thanks to the students, the Perspective team. There are 3 students who have worked very hard on this, and others who have also, read up and, all about your work, and, come up today for this particular session. And last but not the least, Professor Asim Prakash, who has taken the lead to organize this 66th Perspective lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone, and thanks for having me. So
Yeah.
And we
Have a
look at
wonderful
it as a
evening.
continued, dialogue with the call. It is not a one-time lecture. I hope and I wish that, there could be some continued interaction with you where, we could think of other
I'm very
formats.
happy, talking to students at any time. I mean, please feel free to reach me, no problem.
Right,
I'll be
right. We
more
can
than
think
happy.
of different formats and, we can think
Sure.
of different ways of engagement.
Please. I mean, I would be more than happy.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thanks.
All of you have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.
Bye. Good night. Take care.
Good night.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.